Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing marvelously well. I'm sitting here with the wonderful Jerry Hammack. How the devil are you, my friend?
I'm doing great this morning, Warren. Thanks for asking.
Excellent. Now, we've already chatted a little bit off camera here, but we talked like a couple of weeks ago now, just to sort of you introduce yourself to me and told me about basically this is an amazing series of books. It's four books. The first one is, what is it, 60? Well, wait there. No, what? It's 61 is the first.
Yeah, 1961 through 1964, and it covers the Beatles recordings, their earliest recordings with Tony Sheridan, all the way through the Beatles for sale.
Now, you very kindly sent me some stuff to read, so I did a little bit of homework, of course, and then we talked about it at length the first time we talked. And I will say, what I love about it is the insight is fantastic because you spoke to assistant engineers. You got more of a feel. It's not just like here, this guy turned up and plugged in a guitar and recorded. There's a sort of there's a feel for why Ringo did or didn't play on something at first. I mean, I'd like you to talk about that, not just me, obviously, but there's so much more to it than just a generic kind of like list of gear or something like that. It's really it made me basically go to Wikipedia and start researching everybody and reading their, I love it when it goes me down that rabbit hole of just research. And I'm just scraping the surface.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I was really felt like I was walking a bit of a line. I wanted to write the book that I didn't have. That was basically it, and it took a lot of detective work to figure out how the Beatles brought these songs together in the studio. So to find all those things, to track that down to be of service to my clients took so much work. I was like, I want to get this done once and for all, and that led me on a 8-year journey to get these books together.
Fantastic. Oh, to me, I love the minutia, the detail of, well, the most fascinating thing, of course, was that first Decca recording.
Yeah.
And talking about like how nervous they were and how it showed through on some of the recordings. And Dick Rowe auditions them at Decca. As you pointed out, George, you were saying, didn't come across too well on that, but Pete Best did, which is interesting, of course, because Pete Best very famously didn't end up being the full-time drummer for obvious reasons.
Well, no, Pete. If you listen back to like to the Decca session, which is pretty much our closest clue to how Pete really played with the Beatles. He's not the horrible drummer that history, would lead you to believe. He's not a very original drummer. Uh, Certainly, the criticism about some waywardness in his timekeeping is there, but he drives the band home for the most part. And in the Decca sessions, what's exposed is just a really nervous band. Uh, McCartney and Lennon are doing things with vocals that you get the idea that they're like trying to impress the schoolmaster, that they're trying a little bit too hard. Now, when they get to their own songs in the session, which is Like Dreamers Do is one of them that led off, uh, Love of the Loved, and Hello Little Girl. These are songs that they didn't have any model for. They weren't trying to be Buddy Holly. They weren't trying to be anyone else. And in those, you start to get a taste of what the Beatles are really going to sound like. And that's pretty interesting to me, where they are themselves, they're at their best.
So what is the conclusion, just because I go off on this little tangent, with Pete Best obviously leaving the band? What is your sort of conclusion from the information? Because you're now going back and you're talking to assistant engineers, you're talking to people that were at those sessions, and you're getting a completely different insight. What is your conclusion?
Well, Pete was never going to make it with the Beatles. He just couldn't keep up, and so again, serviceable drummer, absolutely. But the Beatles were as much friends and allies going after the same thing together as they were anything else. The Beatles camp's really small. It's really insular. And as I've again been working over the years here, it's very evident that you're either in the club or you're not in the club. And that went for the technical staff at EMI too, where even though they played an integral role in the creation of the music, they weren't in the club. They weren't the Beatles. And Mark Lewison points out that Pete didn't really socialize with the Beatles. Even in Hamburg, he didn't socialize with the Beatles. Now, on the other hand, in Hamburg, Ringo socialized with the Beatles. So there was that like-mindedness. So Pete was never going to fit in over time. And it just so happened that when they had their big opportunity then with Parlophone, EMI, and Ron Richards and George Martin were there, listening to this music and not really digging the groove that was coming across. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I think inevitably he wouldn't have lasted.
Right, absolutely. Well, that makes sense in any band dynamic. It's you get somebody who maybe doesn't click, but if they're bringing it, you deal. We've all been in bands where there might be a girl or a guy in the band that really doesn't sort of click, maybe emotionally, but if they're just bringing their massive talent and they're driving it, whatever it might be, whether it be songwriting, singing, hey, we've all worked with singers with, one of the great thing about singers in particular is the bigger their ego, probably the better they are as a singer, but boy, is that difficult to deal with when you're in the studio, as you know. Anyway, but that's interesting. I love that insight, and that does make sense because it's a band, it's a dynamic, it's a bunch of guys set to take over the world, and having been in bands myself, it's like you're married to the other members of the band. It's like a marriage of 3, 4, 5 people.
Well, absolutely, and as pretty quickly, the Beatles achieved their levels of fame at a pretty rapid pace. And it's super important to keep in mind that their career essentially spanned this 61 period where they're starting to record and ended. It fundamentally ended in 1969. They did a little bit of additional work in 1970 to clean up some of the Let It Be sessions to get them ready to go. But that's not a long period of time to be together. And Beatlemania happened full-on Beatlemania happened within 3 years of their initial recordings. So, how do you deal with that? These guys are, they're in their early 20s. We were sharing the other day when we were talking about Sgt. Pepper, and I was relating the story that Danny Harrison had shared that. He's talking to his dad. He's all proud. He graduated from college. That's fantastic. And George Harrison thinks about it for a second. He says, graduated from that's so great. Now, what was I doing at age 23? Oh, yeah, Sgt. Pepper.
I know George was, 26 when they broke up?
I think 26, 27, but don't quote me on it.
Yep. Either way,
young. 26 is probably right because I believe Lennon was 29 when all was said and done with the Beatles. So, so there you are. These guys aren't out of their 20s, and they've made 12 amazing albums. And come on.
And thanks for bringing that up because it makes me, I think of because obviously the Beatles. And people can argue with this, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a fact, were the first boy band. They were the first band of good-looking guys that girls went crazy about. And a good percentage of their first few songs were covers because they had written songs, but they definitely didn't write enough to put out 2 albums a year, immediately like that, and tour and EPs and singles and all the other when now people put out albums every 2 to 3 years. In that space, they would have put out, 4 or 5 albums in 2 to 3 years. So, but as you're pointing out, they evolved. And, even bands now that are like the pop bands that are they still maintain writer producers. They go into rooms, they work with writers, producers. They end up like crafting a song, as you're pointing out, based on what is current and what will sell. And the Beatles were definitely taking influences from other places, whether it be the Beach Boys were obviously a big influence, listening to them, and vice versa. There was some synergy between those, which very famously with Sgt. Pepper's and Pet Sounds and Revolver, the way they all kind of, and Rubber Soul, the way they kind of all listened to each other's records. However, they were sort of challenged. And I think that for me, at least, what makes them so remarkable, and other artists as well, Bowie and Queen and Peter Gabriel, there's lots of artists that I consider in this sort of mold, is that they're all complete artists. They're people that want to be great musicians, great songwriters. They want the visuals to be incredible. They want to, they do film, they're like the real deal. They're not sort of showing up to sing a track that somebody else has written for them, and or co-written or whatever. They're proud. They're owning it. I don't know. It's not just, as you're pointing out, based on money alone. It's not just like the motivating factor is like, oh, we have to be successful.
Well, they earned that freedom through the money. They were. I guess the powers that be at Powerful and EMI recognized that, whatever these guys are doing, we don't have to understand it. It's making us money. And that gave them the freedom then to go and park themselves in Studio 2 and frustrate the living daylights out of the engineers that were working with them, because early recordings by the Beatles and early recordings in that EMI system, you could think of it like a factory, that there were 3 scheduled recording slots each day. They would go in, they knew what they were going to do. There were studio setup sheets that were provided for the brown coats, which were the technical engineers.
The brown coats.
Yeah, they'd go in and set up microphones and place everything, because they knew what they were doing. These guys were stone cold pros, and they banged through this work. You were expected to come out with product at the end of a session that could be pressed and released and make money. The Beatles broke that mold through their success by saying, not quite sure what we want to do, but we're going to do something good, and went in and could take their sweet time. Now, unfortunately, their sweet time increasingly meant they'd show up at 7 or 8 o'clock at night and they'd work till 2, 3, 4 in the morning, which for a family man, who's the guy on the other side of the glass, like yourself, not the greatest schedule when you're waiting for them to figure out what they want to do. So
I'm sure Geoff Emerick then became like their knight in shining armor, because he was even younger than them, wasn't he, at first?
He was. The EMI system was to, they brought in people that had an interest in audio engineering, but they weren't like today where you can actually get a degree in audio engineering. They just showed an interest, seemed like decent guys, and they came to work. Another interesting thing about working with the Beatles was they got not a great. They grew to have not a great reputation because they were very insistent on everyone in the background being ready for them to do their thing. And as they got more mature in their careers, that insistence became more strident, especially like on Lennon's behalf. And so, getting the gig to work with the Beatles was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it makes your career. For someone coming in like post Emerick, Ken Scott coming in, it makes your career. He went on to what? Supertramp, Elton John,
Hunky Dory.
Yeah, David Bowie.
Yeah.
But to get there, you have to suffer through, John Lennon swearing at you when you're not ready, right when he's ready to sing. You didn't spool the tape right, I'm going to yell at you. And now, but we can't forget, those of us who do engineering, that role despite being maybe disparaged by the Beatles, was absolutely essential. It getting that work right and being dedicated to getting that piece of the puzzle together made all the difference in the world to what the band sounded like. The early recordings with Norman Smith as the engineer, Richard Lang was the second engineer. Norman Smith made those early recordings by the decisions he made as the lead engineer, balance engineer, they called him. His decisions about mic placement, mic selection, those were all made up front, and he made those. The secret sauce of the early Beatles recordings is actually a U47, U48 microphone that he would place about 20 feet away from the band. There was no isolating or baffling of amplifier cabinets or anything. And that mic was out in the room, and he would blend just a taste of that in to maintain that live feel. That's especially effective in the mono recordings, right? Because you're building a bit of a room from that. But it's his decisions as the engineer, as much as it would be Martin's decisions as producer in the sculpting and arrangement of the song itself, that brought those songs to life in a way that we end up loving all these years later. They left the UK as a pretty marginal little rock band, and they came back pros. And it was all out of necessity. They had to perform 7-8 hours a night, 6 days a week. That's what they signed up for. That's what you do. And granted, there were a few enhancements that helped them make it through that schedule, but that weren't necessarily so good for their lifestyle in the long run. But they seized that opportunity, and they came back and were, heads and tails above any other act in Liverpool. That helped them then solidify the Liverpool following. The solid Liverpool following got them Epstein. Epstein was able to use his muscle to help initially get them the auditions, but the confidence they gained in Hamburg translated to their inner relationship, the personal relationship that they had upon initially meeting George Martin. And that brought him completely into the fold.
Now, what was the process of bringing in Ringo, and then obviously very famously, I was about to say, now very famously not playing on some of the first recordings on Love Me Do, but I found out from your book that he is actually on Love Me Do. He's on is it the album version but not the single, is that correct?
He's on the single version, not the album version.
Oh, wow. Isn't that crazy? So is it still pressed that way? So if I was to buy the single, what do they do now, or do they?
Unfortunately, with that, you're talking to the wrong guy.
Oh, okay.
Because part of me getting this right was to ignore contemporary releases. So sure. I went back and got either vinyl or needle drop versions of the original mono and stereo releases, with all their idiosyncrasies, without all the errors that were in them. That's what they recorded. So that's what I kept track of. That's the story that I wanted to tell, was how those were built. The work I think the work up to maybe 2009 is where you have to cut yourself off in relation to understanding really what the Beatles did, because post 2009, now we have the repackaging, the remixing, and that, and they're able to do through technology what the Beatles weren't able to do in their time. So they can grab master tapes and use the deconstructed master tapes to reassemble a mix. Beatles didn't have those options. They had to make decisions as they went. Echo chambers, plate reverbs, those sorts of things. Those are printed as they recorded. They weren't, we'll figure out what we're going to do with all that later. No, you figure it out now, and you're on the clock, by the way, so figure it out quick. But early on, Ringo came into the fold once Pete was decided that he wasn't going to cut it. And these were the earliest June sessions at EMI. Ringo's first sessions weren't that impressive. His first session wasn't that impressive, and so to ensure that he got some product out the back end, George Martin asked Ron Richards to bring in a studio pro, and that happened to be Andy White. And Andy White's on actually a couple of recordings. I think From Me to You and Love Me Do have Andy White performances.
So that's great. So Ringo's on the single. So the question is that if Ringo's on the single, that's what's getting played on the radio.
In the UK, that's what's getting played on the radio. Yeah.
So that's
mono singles in the UK. Mono is everything in the UK. And I think a lot of your viewers are going to understand that the mono versions of the Beatles records are the versions of the Beatles records up to Abbey Road, essentially, because stereo just hadn't made the dent. People listened to everything in mono. In the US, stereo was king, but in the UK, it was mono.
Wow. So, but I find that very exciting then, because that sort of misconception that I had, and because Ringo still sort of like jokes about it. It's seemingly, I don't know if that's true, seemingly seems to joke about not being used on those couple of songs there. So that misconception made me believe that there was never a Ringo version available. But what was propelling the success of the band was radio play, and the radio play was Ringo.
Yeah.
So there you go. So it always was really Ringo. Well, there you go. I never knew that. That's wonderful. That's worth the price of admission. Knowing these kind of things in a book really makes it exciting. We're talking like the first ever single, and there's already a massive piece of information for me, which makes the book very compelling. So in those first 3 or 4 years that you're analyzing, what other was there anything else like that for you where you were like, oh, I didn't know that? Because you're a fan, obviously, as well. That's why you're writing the book. You're an engineer and you're a fan. It must have been exciting to turn up little gems. Is there anything else you could enlighten us with?
Yeah, and I guess this is pretty geeky stuff, but in the assembly of the music, like She Loves You, that's an edit. That's not a continuous backing track performance or total performance. That's the backing track assembly of She Loves You is from an edit, and now that can ruin the song for you once you know that there's the edit there, and once you've heard the edit. Now, of course, it's nothing you can't unhear it. You always.
Where's the edit?
Well, it's about 2/3 of the way through the track.
Right.
And I'll encourage you not to try to hear it, because you'll never hear the song the same again. But I think for me, what came across was how much was actually tracked live through a great majority of the initial albums. There were very, very few overdubs or superimpositions, they call them at the time, that were involved in the creation of these songs. A lot of it was straight up performance, rehearsal, get it right, track it. And that's pretty amazing to me that they were pulling it together like that, because I grew up in the 60s and started really understanding like the multi-track world in the 70s, and with that you tend to think about that everything's tracked individually, right? Pristine, clear. We get a backing track down, but it's a reference, and now we're going to replace it and fill in, and that backing track goes away, that reference track goes away. No, not with the Beatles. The Beatles performed this stuff. This Boy was performed. They played it and sang it. This
Right.
Boy. Now they beefed up the vocals, but that was performed. They were playing it, they were singing it, and a tighter 3-part harmony. I challenge you to find.
That's great. Absolutely amazing. While you were talking, I was singing "She Loves You." I was singing it in the background, and my mind just thinking stuff. She loves you, you know you can't be, you can't be bad. Yeah, is it there? When it changes feel completely, is that the edit? It is. It's got to be.
Well,
Okay.
I'm not going to give you that one, Warren. I'm afraid I don't want to be the person that ruined the song for you.
Well, I'm gonna read it anyway and find out. So, so will it ruin it for me? I don't know. It's like you know, some of the multi-tracks that are available by different artists are completely fascinating, and if anything, it makes me enjoy it more when I know some of the process.
Well, I think one of the nice things about being involved in this work and being involved in doing engineering and producing is the listening experience can be really, really rich. Your ears are trained over the years to pull things out and pull things apart and really appreciate the artistry that went into building that song or the decision that had to be made that creates that feeling for you in a finished track. So and there's lots of moments like that with the Beatles work. There are lots of decisions that Martin made that made the song stronger. There were lots of decisions they made in how they recorded it that made them more compelling experiences. And it's one of the gifts of what we do, that we get to experience music that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's incredible. The more I find out, especially when it comes to like what you're talking about, I assume what you're talking about is it 2 full takes that are just edited together?
Yeah, so the Beatles would do edit pieces a lot of the times in the early years. An edit piece could involve the entire band, and you'll see some examples where the initial backing track was a 2-track recording, a 2-track mono recording. So distinct left and right channel was going on. And then when it came to they did an edit piece. The edit piece was 2-track stereo. All of the entire band was recorded, but the sound was spread across the sound field, right? It wasn't allocated to backing band and the left track or track 1, and the right track, track 2 was having the vocals allocated. So if you listen to the early stereo versions, you can hear where it goes from a backing track to an edit piece, because you'll hear the sound collapse and you get a stereo field image, as opposed to hearing distinct left and right things going on. There are diagrams in the book that if you follow them through, the diagram helps you understand the breakout of the instruments and the vocals in order to start to identify those things going on. And I walk you through the milestones along the way of where they said, okay, that's enough for the backing track. Take 4 was the keeper, and now we're going to do overdubs, and what they did in that. And I think in that sense, it's a nice companion for just the pure listening experience, let alone understanding the particulars of how it was assembled.
Wow. So give me this is incredible. So give me a synopsis. So book 1 is out. That's 61 to 64, which goes through to which album?
Yeah, so the first book out now covers 61 through 64, so early recordings through Beatles for Sale. I plan on releasing a new volume about every 6 months,
Great.
The next one is going to cover 1965 and 66, so that's Help through Revolver. And the third book will be 1967 only, just due to the amount of work that they did and recording that they did during that period. So that's going to be Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. And then book 4 will be a bit of a monster because it covers then the White Album era all the way through Abbey Road. Let It Be sandwiched in between the two. So those are the 4 books in total, and they should all be available within the next 18 months.
It's so amazing. Just as a complete sideline, Let It Be is my favorite Beatles album. Now,
I grew up with it, and I never understood the extreme animosity toward it. There's just some joyous work in it, and there's some great live work in it.
exactly.
And actually, I think so. I've been through the 80 CDs of Nagar reels that comprise the Let It Be sessions. This is the AB audio that was recorded in conjunction with the film that no one wanted to edit. And the interesting aspect of all of that audio is what you hear is not only the creation of the Let It Be album, but you hear the birth of Abbey Road, which is super cool. She Came In Through the Bathroom Window, I Want You, She's So Heavy. These are songs that they were bringing into the Let It Be sessions to try out and start to work on. But the overall atmosphere of those recording sessions is positive. The story of the film, and I think because it came out post breakup, is pretty dour. It's got a bit of a hangover mood to it.
Which makes no sense because, as you're pointing out, it was recorded between the White Album and Abbey Road. So it's a rite of passage. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think where that all comes from is purely the circumstance. You had them going into Twickenham Studio One to do the film and the album, they thought at the time, and they were showing up at 10 a.m. in the morning to make rock and roll music. And it's a big, cold, cavernous film studio, and it's not made to record in, not made to record music in. So when they get back, and you can actually see this in the film if you can get your hands on the film. The Beatles are keeping that one to themselves.
We used to watch it on TV in England. They would play all the Beatles films on TV, and Let It Be used to play all the time. Is there high quality versions of the film out there?
There's DVD quality bootleg versions of the film, but they're very hard to find. I was lucky to come across one. Interesting tidbit for you. The one that I tracked down also had some B-roll in it. And in the B-roll, you see George Harrison working on the solo for Let It Be. And he's playing his Rocky Stratocaster for the solo. He's not playing what everyone assumes, which is the Rosewood Telecaster prototype. Yep. He's actually playing his Magical Mystery Tour era Strat as he's working on that song. So, which one's on the solo for Let It Be? Anyone who tells you definitively they know, they're lying to you.
Yeah, all I can say is, though, after watching Let It Be as a kid and watching it on TV when they used to show it all the time, I wanted a Rosewood Telecaster. I still want a Rosewood Telecaster because of it.
No, it's a gorgeous guitar.
It weighs about 6 tons. It's solid rosewood. I played one of the original ones many, many, many years ago. I was in a store that had one, and it weighed a ton, but I covet that guitar. It's
What I was going to say was as far as the session goes, and again, if you can see the film, you'll notice they moved to Apple Studios, an unfinished Apple Studios, to actually record the album. So other than the live performance songs, which make up the majority of the album, the rooftop concert, they recorded the song in the basement at their studio on Seville Road. And when you see them move into that environment on the film, everything's changed. Some of that has to do with Billy Preston's presence on the sessions, because the Beatles didn't want to look like jackasses in front of Billy Preston, who they respected. They had known him from back in Hamburg days as well, and they also just flat out respected him as a musician. But you can see the joy that's missing in the rest of the film, and the joy that you can hear, and the playfulness that you can hear in all of those hours of audio that are out there, if you're lucky enough like me to be able to track it down.
Amazing. I have to come over to your house one day and just rifle through this stuff. 80 CDs worth of outtakes.
Yeah. I've collected in different release versions, mono stereo release versions, takes of songs, outtakes, different remixes of the songs. My Beatles library is about 5,700 songs.
So just a couple.
Yeah. Well, that's what 8 years will get you, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. So how long have you been working on these books?
8 years.
8 years. That's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. Well, we're going to put like a link so you can purchase the book, obviously.
I see it right there.
There it is. It's flying around somewhere. Jerry, we could do this all day, but what I would like to do is come back to you in 6 months when the second one's out, and we'll talk about that period.
Oh, I'd love that, Warren. I'd appreciate that, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about it today, and hopefully this is of value to the people that watch your feed.
It's absolutely huge. All right, one last question.
Yeah.
On that first book, what is the biggest takeaway that you have from book one?
From where all of this was born. So as a audio engineer, the biggest takeaway was you don't need a room full of expensive gear to make fantastic music. The Beatles did everything they did with compressor, the Alltech compressor primarily. They had the Fairchild limiter. They had EQs, some plug-in EQ boxes. And they had an echo chamber and some repeat echo and plate echo. They did everything they did with that. And
what EQ, when you say like a hardware EQ that they plugged into, what was it?
Well, they actually had these plug-in EQ boxes. The red 51 and 37 boards that they used had some onboard EQ shelving, but they also had these discrete plug-in modules that would handle a part of the EQ spectrum that physically plugged into the red board. So they had those. They also had a tool later on called a curve bender, which was a little more discrete. But the Beatles used some very basic shelving in their equalization. Probably the most sophisticated EQ they had at the time was one that was specific to the Neumann microphones. And so that one helped either tame the top end of the microphone or give it a little incremental boost at certain frequencies. But that's it. So my biggest takeaway was that you can make great music with very straightforward tools. And I think the work I do now, as a lot of people do, is in Pro Tools. And the takeaway for me is that you don't need a sea of plugins. You don't need to live there to get things done. You need to know how to use the core tools of equalization, compression, balancing, stereo imaging, once you have those kind of core things down, you can make some pretty amazing music.
Fantastic.
And then it's the song, man. You got to have a great song.
You've got to have a great song. All right. Thank you ever so much, Jerry. I really appreciate all your time. Very excited to read this book and, of course, all the upcoming ones. I'll see you again on the next one. And thank you, everybody. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. Maybe I can throw Jerry under the bus and answer any questions. You feel like doing that?
Sure.
Oh, sure. Okay.
I can only fail at it.
I fail several times a day. Trust me. Just ask my wife. So Jerry, incredibly kindly, is giving us 6. Did 7 fingers. 6 books to give away. 6 books, and they will be signed by Jerry. So this is an amazing opportunity to be first to get something incredibly collectible. I don't even think you necessarily have to be a Beatles fan. You just have to be a recording music fan to want this book, let alone a Beatles fan. So as usual, go and enter all the schnizzle below. We'll do a raffle where you get to every action you do. If you tweet about it, if you Facebook, if you name it, if you do all these different actions, you'll increase your likelihood of winning a copy of the book. I've already read big chunks of it that Jerry sent me, and it is massively exciting. This is, for me, an incredibly important piece of work. 8 years of Jerry's life have gone into this. And as you can see, it's pretty darn amazing. And Jerry's going to sign the book.
Just for you.
Marvelous. All right. Have a marvelous time recording and mixing. I'll speak to you all again soon. Thanks, Jerry.